Hello and welcome back to FatbossTV. We're back from another set of raid testing on the Legion Alpha, and today we're looking at Trilliax in the Suramar Palace.
And Trilliax, what a boss he is. We're not really sure where he's placed within the instance. The dungeon journal suggests that he's the third boss, but where he is anyone's guess. It's a 3-phase encounter where the boss just constantly keeps changing between modes from phase to phase, and it's a very fast-paced encounter. Now, all 3 modes have different abilities, however the boss will keep 2 abilities regardless of which mode he's actually in. He has a passive up on himself that makes it so whenever he takes damage, he will spawn like arcane pools on or near players, and if you stand inside them, you just take ticking damage. You have more than enough time to see where they're going to spawn and actually move out of them, and if you are stood in them, you get even more warnings because your screen gets like a glowing effect, which simply suggests get the fuck out of the puddle.
The other ability he always has is something called Arcane Spare. This will do a large amount of damage to the tank, and this damage is split with one nearby ally. The tank hit by this ability also gets a debuff that will increase all the damage they take by 10% for 30 seconds. So the idea would be to have 2 tanks on top of each other in order to split the damage, and then the tanks to taunt when the stacks get too high or whenever they drop off. We found that you didn't actually have to switch tanks at all, really. The ability doesn't really deal that much damage at all, and you can drop stacks at points in the fight without having to taunt, so if you wanted to, you could have the other tank on follow doing pretty much nothing. I assume they're going to make this deal some damage in the future, but while we're testing it was pretty negligible.
So the boss starts off in mode 1 or phase 1 or whatever you want to call it, which is the cleaner phase. Now in this phase, the boss will constantly spawn cakes through an ability called Toxic Slice. What he'll do is mark several locations around the room and then just throw cakes at them, or like spawn cakes at the location. And if you're stood on top of them when it does spawn, you take a load of damage. You need to make sure you move away from them first, because immediately afterwards, you then need to go and pick up the cake and eat it. Now eating the cake actually applies a hard-hitting dot, however this dot can be dispelled. But the problem with this is that the boss spawns so many cakes, and this pretty much forces your entire raid to run out and eat them. And the reason for this is because once you do eat the cake, you do get a 1-minute debuff that prevents you from eating cakes again, and this is completely undispellable, and it also reduces your movement speed because you become stuffed, so you need to send different people out each time to eat the cakes. But the problem with this is that you're going to have a lot of debuffs, and you're probably going to struggle to out-heal it, or at least that's how it felt. So what you need to do is send players out in a staggered fashion, just so you can keep up with the dispels. Or you could, I guess, potentially make some form of strategy using Mass Dispel.
Or stuff like Revival as well.
Oh, Revival was king on it, yeah.
Yeah, it does really well. But overall, make sure that you do go and eat the cake. Eating the cake is so important, because if you don't eat any cake, the boss is supposed to do an ability that will destroy any leftover cake, and each cake destroyed will do 1,000,000 damage to your raid. So if there's like 4 cakes up, 4 million damage on your raid. So that sounds pretty bad. Unfortunately, the boss didn't cast this ability at all, meaning that you didn't really have to eat the cake to counteract this ability. However, eating the cake is still good practice, as it does affect other mechanics coming up later in the encounter, and it's good to practice for life for when this mechanic does actually come in. Now, after spending around 45 seconds in his cleaner mode, he will then switch to his maniac mode, and this is kind of like phase 2. Now during this phase, the boss will be using Arcane Spare more often, so tanks may want to use big cooldowns as well as maybe external cooldowns to help counteract this. On the testing, of course, it wasn't doing too much damage, but the boss is dealing a fairly high amount of ticking damage to the raid for an ability called Mana Rupture. He applies this buff to himself at the beginning of his Maniac mode, and it lasts throughout the entire duration, just dealing light ticking damage to the entire raid. And because of this, it is ideal that you can try and remain somewhat close together in order to get the most out of AoE healing. It is also helpful to be close together for another ability he does called Searing Bonds. This will debuff 2 players and bind them together, and if they're not stood on top of each other, they'll be taking pretty high ticking damage every 0.25 seconds, so a fucking lot of ticking damage. To counteract this ability, you just need to get the 2 players to stand together. It is important to note though that this can happen between a melee and a ranged player, and if this does happen, of course, it's best that the ranged player goes to melee so they can both continue dealing damage.
After being in this phase for around 20 seconds, the boss will actually leap to the middle of the room, knock anyone back near his landing area, and cast another ability called Annihilation. And this is pretty much a Halion Beam from Ruby Sanctum, and it works the exact same way in the sense that you also pretty much get one shot. What the boss will do is just send out a beam out of his arsehole and out the front of him that just completely dissects the room down the middle. And like I said, stand on this beam, you're dead. The boss will then start slowly rotating, and it's your job to not get caught out by the beam. And this can be somewhat difficult to do, especially if you're not in melee range, because the beam does move quite quickly. And to top that, being stuffed at this point, which is still a possibility, makes it even more difficult to move from, because of course you have a reduced movement speed. But using things like stampeding roars, as well as the new shaman speed totems, are really, really useful. One really cool thing about this Annihilation Beam is that sometimes while the boss is rotating around the room, he can suddenly just decide to stop rotating and go in the opposite direction. This is what probably killed the majority of our players.
Yeah, especially the first time we saw it, because it was like, oh, he's just spinning. Okay, just stay at the side, stay at the side. And we was kind of going a little bit ahead of where we should have, maybe. And then he switched and just killed loads and loads of people. So yeah, you do have to be extra careful for when he is going to turn around. But as long as you're like fairly close to the middle of the room, whilst not being in knockback range before this ability comes in, you have more than enough time to position at his side and then stay there so you can just not get hit by the beam.
And also another problem with this beam is that, of course, while you're moving around, there are going to be all these patches on the ground.
Yeah.
And sometimes you can get caught out and you're pretty much forced to move through the patches. So you do take even more ticking damage from that as you're running around, which is, yeah, just more damage and makes your healer's jobs a little bit harder. And of course, they might not be able to cast all the time because they're going to be moving from the beam as well. But anyway, after rotating around with a beam of death for around 15 seconds, the boss will then finally enter his third phase, which is the Caretaker mode. Now, during this short phase, the boss will no longer melee hit anyone, nor will he use his Arcane Spare ability on the tanks. However, he will still spawn the pools of shit on the floor through his passive. But what he'll do now is that he'll throw out some succulent feasts. It would throw out 3 for us every single time, but we assume with less or maybe even more players, the number will be different. Now, when you run over these feasts, that player, whoever soaked it, will get a buff that simply gives them a 3 million damage absorb shield, as well as the stuff debuff. Now, this absorb shield we think is supposed to be used for the next mechanic he does, which is something called Tidy Up. What he does is that he spawns several scrubbers around the sides of the room, and these scrubbers are pretty much indestructible. Any attacks going on them doesn't really dent their HP at all. The scrubbers also have an aura around them that makes it so they deal a lot of damage to anyone stood nearby. And this aura does appear to be much larger than the animation would actually suggest, so we made sure just to give them as much room as we possibly could. Now, the scrubbers would just harmlessly go around the room, removing as many arcane seepage pools as possible. However, after the boss has summoned these adds, he will then quickly go back into his first mode, the cleaner, where he'll start spawning more and more cake. And these scrubber robots absolutely fucking love cake. So what they do, as soon as they see a cake, they'll start running towards it. If they actually get there and they eat it, they will then start to explode. Now, when the cast is finished from this explosion, they do a ton of damage to the entire raid and then die. If too many of these scrubbers explode within quick succession, your entire raid is going to wipe. However, if you right-click the scrubbers as they're exploding, you'll jump on top of them and stop their cast and they'll despawn. Now, when you do actually jump on top of the scrubbers, you take a fair amount of physical damage and get knocked up into the air, which sort of prevents you from just sending one person to go and do every single one of the scrubbers. So you do need to set up a small group of people, and that's what we think these initial feasts are for. You get the 3 mil absorb shield, and then that allows you to go and jump on all the individual scrubbers. However, the explosion from the scrubbers themselves, when you do click on them, was so small that we didn't even need any form of damage reduction or external cooldown or anything. We didn't need shit. So we just had random people going around and clicking on them, and it seemed to work perfectly fine. But maybe not so much on normal, maybe on heroic, probably mythic. The idea is, I think, that you go pick up these succulent feasts, and those players would then go and jump on top of the scrubbers.
Now, you can also eat the cake before the scrubbers get to them, and if the scrubbers eventually run out of things to eat, they seem to just go to the edge of the room and just despawn. This might be a more effective way of dealing with these robots, but really the choice is up to you. We didn't have enough time to really try out both strats, but it's definitely something that you might want to keep in mind. Now, the boss will also apply a debuff to multiple players during this phase called Sterilize. This will cause them to deal ticking damage to anyone within 12 yards for 40 seconds. Now, the Dungeon Journal suggests that it's supposed to disrupt the scrubbers in some way. However, we found that it doesn't really affect them at all. At this time on testing, it doesn't really do anything. Like, lightning goes towards them, but that's about it. Instead, we just had the players just move away from the group and wait for it to time out. It was just kind of a little bit annoying. That was pretty much it. And then from there, the fight would just keep repeating. The boss would just continually switch between his different modes in order until he eventually falls down.
And this is a great fight.
It was an amazing fight. I super enjoyed doing this because it's super fast paced and there's loads of mechanics to keep you on your toes. And the fact that the boss just throws out cake whilst complaining that you're leaving crumbs on the floor. But the thing is, one really nice thing is that this fight has so much room for optimization. Like, if you really wanted to, you could like devise a strategy where everyone's stacked up to make it so the arcane pools are always on like one side of the room. And then when he goes into his annihilation phase, you could all be on the other side of the room, making it so you don't take any damage. Or if all those pools are on top of each other, maybe the scrubbers would do their job quicker and maybe fuck off quicker. So,
which might give you room to have a single person soak everything with like a massive damage reduction or an immunity up or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. And the thing is, with the mechanics as well, a lot of them are really, really impactful. Like the annihilation, when it catches you out, you know you fucked up big time because it instantly kills you. And you can just see it coming, slowly turning towards you, and then just suddenly go the other way. Like, the feeling of panic when that comes in is really, really fun to deal with. A couple of other things is that just during that annihilation phase, I felt super sorry for all the casters, because you do need to move a lot, because you don't know if the boss is going to switch directions. Maybe boss mods will be able to, like, predetermine that, and it will help you plan your movement. But at least while we were doing it, the poor casters did fuck all when that was going on, because
you're moving for a full 15 seconds.
Yeah, pretty much. And the healers as well, you really struggled to do any sort of long casts. So things like boomkins, it's not nice for them at all. Apart from the things that are a little incomplete, such as the exploding cakes not being in there, maybe that's planned to be a mythic mechanic, even though it's in the heroic mode dungeon journal. Of course, it's alpha, things are all over the place. And of course, the sterilized debuff doing literally nothing. Apart from those two little things, it's still a really, really good boss. Yeah. And they are planning on testing it again. This test was kind of a little bit part of just testing out the build to see if it would work. So hopefully when we get to test it again, it's going to be feature complete and there'll be even more delicious cake to eat.
But that's all we got time for in this video. For more information about Trilliax and our time spent testing him, check out our blog on WoW Amino. WoW Amino is a new community app that's made entirely for WoW players, where you can make personal blogs, set up polls, ask questions for the community, and much more. The app is entirely free, and signing up is very, very easy. You can find download links for both iOS and Android in the description.
So a big thanks to Warcraft Amino for sponsoring this video, and thank you guys for watching, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks for watching.